Can you give me some words that pop into your head?
Omniscient.
Pardon?
Omniscient.
Omniscient. Wow, we're going with the big words first.
Omnipresent.
Pardon? What does omniscient mean?
All-knowing.
All-knowing, thank you.
Omnipresent.
Omnipresent. What does omnipresent mean, for those who don't know that one either?
All present. Everywhere at once.
Okay.
Transcendent.
Pardon?
Transcendent.
Transcendent. What does that one mean?
Outside of space and time.
Okay. Love, thank you. Any more small words? Does everyone know what love means? No, we'll go into that later. Up the back there, Josh. Pardon? Good. That's a good one. Nice short word. Forgiving?
Like.
Pardon?
Like. God is.
That's true. Is? Everything? Eternal? Eternal. Can you tell I'm not a school teacher? I don't have very neat handwriting on the board. Anyone else? Pardon? Restful? Merciful, sorry. I think I've got old ears. Awesome. Powerful. Truth. Compassionate. A friend. Yep. Heaps cool. I like that language. King. Space VR. Omnipotent. I was waiting for the last omni word. What about omnibus? Omnipotent means all powerful. Omnibus means it's the long word for a bus. Okay. Is that all? Run out of words? Let's make that all for the moment. Not sure this stand's going to work for me after all. Okay. So, I have to say that if I do this exercise, the first one that comes to me, and maybe because it actually says it in the Bible somewhere, is God is love. And that is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. But the other one that comes to me, like especially when I was a kid, when I thought about God, I used to imagine somebody perfect. Do you reckon perfect fits that too? God is perfect? Let's put it up. Okay, so what I want to do is throw it over to you again, turn the whiteboard around, and start with my two first ideas of God. Yep, alright, so I'm not very strong either. Okay, so if I asked you to describe what perfect love might look like, could you give me some words? Unconditional. Yep. Selfless. Trustworthy. Yeah, steady, or maybe another way to learn is stable. Yeah. Eternal.
Agape.
Forgive me, sorry?
Agape.
Agape, okay. Forgiving, agape. What does agape mean? That's not a big word.
words for love.
Yeah, so it's another word for love.
Why?
It's got a very technical definition, but love's the best one. Okay, what else? Do you see more hands?
Patient.
Patient. Passionate. Humble. Probably, but it's another way of putting it. Yeah. Enduring. Yeah. Open. Okay, that'll do maybe for the moment. Now, here's the million-dollar question. Apart from God, and you might not experience this anyway, does anyone know somebody who loves like that, or loves them like that in particular? Who? Your parents. Your parents love you like that? Pretty close? You've got pretty good parents. Pete's parents happen to be my aunt and uncle, so I think they're pretty cool too. Well, I think Pete's just given me a link into the next bit of my talk. I was going to talk a little bit about God as Father. So, I have to say, when I was thinking about this, I don't know anyone who loves me perfectly, not even Pete's parents. My parents are pretty cool, and my dad is pretty cool in particular, because I want to talk about God as Father, which is one of the ways that he reveals himself to us. But he's definitely not even close to perfect. When I was a little kid, I used to think about God, and I think that God was something like my dad, only like the really perfect version. Like my dad gets a bit impatient sometimes, but God's never impatient. And sometimes my dad would get angry, but God was never angry. And my dad wasn't always fair. You know, sometimes he gave my sisters a better deal, but God's always fair. Sometimes my dad was away, God's always there for me. So my experience of God as Father has been a pretty positive one, right? But I'm aware that not everybody in the world has perfect parents, eh? Not everybody in the world has loving parents. And some people wouldn't be able to answer like Pete and say, my parents love me like this. But I want us to get really objective for a minute, like we did just then when we were talking about the idea of perfect love. Because God reveals himself to us as a parent figure. Throughout the Old Testament, we get all this imagery of God as a loving Father. And he doesn't just reveal himself as loving Father, but he reveals himself in terms of like a mother's love as well. He talks of himself as loving us better than our mothers even. But I think it's fair to say that for all of us, whether or not we experience this kind of love from our parents, it's through our parents that we first either receive love or lack of love. And funnily enough, I actually don't want to focus on the love, but the lack of love bit. I think some of us, at least, will be able to think of times when they didn't really receive love like they thought they should from their parents. Is that fair enough? Even people with pretty good parents, there's moments when you go, oh, I think you just failed. That's not really what love's like. That's not unconditional love. That's not forgiving love. That was not patient. Fair enough? Yeah. And even if we haven't had that experience, even if we have perfect parents, we probably know other people who don't, right? Or have heard of other people who don't. People whose parents might have neglected them or really hurt them somehow. How does it make you feel when you think about that lack of love? Bad? Yeah. Hurt? When you experience it? Does it make you feel a bit angry sometimes? Outraged even? That somebody could be treated in a way that's not loving? Not necessarily even by their parents, just by another person? It's not fair, is it? No. This is a bit weird for a talk on God's love, isn't it? I think where I'm going with this, what I want to suggest, is that there's something in us that already tells us the recipe for God's love. And we can get in touch with it best when we see lack of love and get in touch with the wrongness that we feel inside, with lack of love. That a love that is less than perfect. We can see that it's less than perfect, can't we? We feel like, no, that's not right, that's not good, that's not what love's like. Mum, you're not supposed to treat me like that. You're not supposed to treat her like that. Because somewhere in our hearts we already know, it's written on our hearts, what real love is, what perfect love is. You just told me. Real love is unconditional. Real love is forgiving. Perfect love is eternal, it's passionate, it's trustworthy, it's patient, it's selfless, it's enduring. Why else would we be not surprised when we see, for instance, a mass murderer on television and they're about to die, being sentenced to death, and their mother still loves them and is really sad when they're dying? That's real love, isn't it? There's something in us that can understand a love that's unconditional, that looks and says, that's still my son. I think what I'm trying to say is that on our hearts, each human heart is written the recipe of God's love, and we know it instinctively. You're able to tell it to me just like, oh, God's love is unconditional, God's love is forgiving, God's love is passionate, it's enduring, it's patient, it's trustworthy, it's selfless. God's love is eternal. So one of my favourite scriptures, and I forgot my Bible, is this one. It's from the prophet Hosea, and it's one of the ones where God wants to reveal himself as a loving Father to us. He says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And I called my son out of Egypt. But the more I called, the more they went away from me. I myself taught Ephraim to walk. I myself took them by the arm. But they did not know that I was the one caring for them. That I was leading them with human ties, with leading strings of love. That with them I was like someone lifting an infant to his cheek, and that I bent down to feed him. Ephraim, how could I part with you? Israel, how could I give you up? My heart within me is overwhelmed. Fever grips my inmost being. I will not give rein to my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God, not man, the Holy One in your midst. And I shall not come to you in anger. So hear it again. For I am God, not man. Now my dad, my parents are pretty wonderful, but they can't love me perfectly. For all the stories I could tell you about the ways that they've loved me, I will tell you a story later, their love is still conditional and still imperfect. Only as God's love is unconditional, forgiving, passionate, trustworthy, enduring, selfless, steady, eternal. So I think that often we can have experiences of our parents and the other authority figures in our lives that unintentionally form us in ideas of a God that is different to this picture of love that we're painting here. We can be told, yes, God's love, God loves you unconditionally, God's love is forgiving, God's love is forgiving, God's love is passionate, God's love is trustworthy, God's love is patient, God's love is enduring. But when we get these same people who are telling us this, being something different to that from ourselves, sometimes sneakily into our hearts and our minds, we can get this image of a God that's a bit different from that. We come to have this image of a God that's maybe distant, maybe a bit rulesy. You have to do this and you're not allowed to do that. A God that's angry, a God that judges us, a God that controls us, a God that likes us only if we're good. One way I've heard this illustrated is of this idea of a God that sits at the top of a mountain. And the idea is that to reach God and to be with God, we have to climb the mountain. And the mountain's high and it's rough terrain. And when we climb that mountain, we get scratched and we get bruised. And it's hard work. And by the time we reach the top, we're pretty exhausted. And that God takes one look at us when we get to the top and goes, not good enough. Get back down, and flicks us down to the bottom of the mountain. Now, I'm not saying that this necessarily is my conscious image of God, but I think sometimes I lapse into an image of God like that I have to try really hard to reach God, to receive God's love. Have you ever felt that way? Or felt like somebody's giving you a bit of an image of a God like that you have to try really hard for? I think that's definitely the way that people who don't know our faith think of us as Christians. That's the experience I've had from my friends, from my non-Christian family members, is that they seem to think that being Christian is all about following the holy rules and being really good so that God won't be angry with me and I might be able to go to heaven and have nice things when I die. Can I just put it out there now, though, from the beginning, that this is not the God I believe in, and it's definitely not the God of Christianity. Not even close. Remember, our God is love. Our God loves us unconditionally. He loves us passionately. His love is enduring, eternal, patient, trustworthy, steady, stable, selfless. So to draw on the same analogy that I was using before, rather than the God who sits at the top of the mountain waiting for us to get to him, our Christian God, our God, comes down the mountain himself to meet us at the bottom of the mountain. And because he wants us to get to the top, to be with him at the top, he picks us up on his shoulders and he carries us to the top of the mountain. So that when we get to the top of the mountain, it's not us, but it's him that's scratched and bleeding and bruised and exhausted. But he considers the whole thing worth it because we got there with him. Now that is a love that's unconditional. That's a love that's forgiving, it's passionate, it's enduring, it's patient, it's trustworthy, selfless, steady, stable. And this idea of God who comes down the mountain to us makes a nice little illustration, but it comes real in the image of Jesus Christ. It literally happened. Jesus is God come to be with us, come to bring us up the mountain with him, if you like. God who loves us that passionately, like I was reading in the scriptures there, wants us to know that love, deeply wants us to know that love. He's passionate about you and me, each one of us. And he wants us to know a love that is unconditional, a love that's forgiving, passionate, stable, enduring, trustworthy, selfless, steady. He deeply wants us to know that. And because no human being has ever been able to show another human being properly that love, he came himself to do that. He became a human being in order to show us what perfect love looks like. How did he do that? Well, having said human beings can't show us this love, I actually want to tell you a story about my dad. So, when I was about 16, I was I wasn't a school actually, it was a diocesan passion play. So every year at Easter, the diocese would have this passion play. And mostly year 11 and 12 students would take all the parts. And this particular year, there were like next to no boys, so I got the role of Peter. So it's like the second last rehearsal, and they're handing out the costumes at the end of the rehearsal. And I was like, looking at this costume I got given, and literally it's a purple sheet folded in half. There were like 2 seams, one down each side, and like a hole cut in the top where the fold was for the head. And I'm thinking, and this is like for Peter, like Simon Peter, like Jesus' best friend Peter. I'm supposed to be Peter in that. I was a bit upset. So I went to the teacher and I'm like, can I do something with this? Can I make it into a real costume? And she's like, can you sew it? I'm like, yeah. She's like, okay, sure. So I took this thing home and I'm having dinner with my family. It's Friday night and I'm telling them all about how I'm going to fix this costume. And my dad, who knows a little bit about making stuff, because he likes to make his own raincoats and that sort of thing, said, well, if I was you, I'd blah, 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 blah. And I sort of tuned him out, because that's what you do when you're 16 and your dad's giving you advice about something you know about. So I didn't really pay much attention. Next morning I got up and spent most of the day making this costume. It's about 3 o'clock. I finish it, try it on, and, well, let's just say it was a little bit too feminine for a costume for Peter. And I couldn't run very well in it because it was a bit narrow. And I didn't want to go anywhere near my dad because I knew if I'd followed his advice it would have been all right. So I'm sort of trying it on, showing my mum, going, oh, what am I going to do? And she's like, well, maybe you could cut some slits up the sides here, otherwise run in the thing. And I'm thinking, yeah, but it still looks like I'm like Petra, not Peter. I'm terrified because the dress rehearsal was the next day and we're like performing that evening. The Sunday evening, and I had to go out to 21st. So I'm like, what am I going to do with this thing? And Mum was like, you're just going to spend it on liner. So I left it all on my bed and went out to this 21st with that kind of sick feeling in my stomach of, oh, I just made a really, really stupid mistake and I could have prevented it. And I managed to enjoy myself enough at the party and forget about it. But we drove back into the driveway and I was like, oh, a sick feeling just came back. I'm walking into the house knowing that I'm about to get absolutely no sleep, trying to fix this stupid costume that is all my own stupid fault. And I walked into my room and the finished costume was lying on my bed, fixed. My dad had just spent the last 6 hours unpicking, cutting and re-sewing to fix it up for me. It was like the best gift in the world. I was just so relieved. I felt about this big because really if I'd followed his advice he wouldn't have needed to give up his time. But I was just so grateful that he managed to look past that and do what I needed to have done. So I was thinking about that and I think in that situation my dad really mirrored God's love to me. I was thinking, in particular, I could map that whole story out as a bit of a story of my life. Like at the beginning of life, I get given this whole beautiful life to do with what I want. And God's a bit like my dad, and he gives me a whole lot of advice that I wasn't asking for about how I might best live that life. And I kind of tune it out because I'm going to do my own thing anyway, hey? And then I make a mess. And that sick feeling inside when you've done something that you can't undo, maybe said something that you can't really unsay, even if you say sorry a million times. And that sick feeling inside that says, oh, what a mess, I don't know how to do anything about this. Well, the beautiful thing that Jesus Christ reveals to us is that God is so much better than my dad. He can fix things that you can't undo humanly. My dad only spent 6 hours of his time when he preferred to be doing something else, fixing a mess I made. Jesus Christ spent his life, poured it out on the cross to show us how much God loves us and fix the mess that we've made with our lives in sin. And he did it because he desperately wanted us to know that his love is unconditional. His love is forgiving, his love is passionate, enduring, trustworthy, selfless, patient, eternal. He considers that giving his whole life for us was totally worth it because he wants us to know that love. If even just one of us is able to look at that cross and go, wow, that's a love that's unconditional. There's a love that's willing to give everything, absolutely everything. There's a love I can trust. There's a love that's forgiving. There's passionate love. There's a love that's enduring, eternal. There's no mess that's too big for God, no sin that's too big for him, and no chance will ever be too late for him. In Jesus, we find perfect love, and it's just like this: unconditional, humble, steady, stable, enduring, passionate, forgiving, selfless, trustworthy. Now I just want to finish with a couple of clips. Who has seen the Narnia movies? Most of you? Oh good, then this isn't going to be anything close to a spoiler. If you haven't, I promise it's not a spoiler. They're one from the very beginning and one from the very end. It doesn't give up. Oh wait, what happens in the middle? So let's start with the first one.
Listen, have you seen this ship before?
Yes. It's very Narnian looking, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, just another reminder that we're here and not there.
There once were two orphans who wasted their time believing in Narnian nursery rhymes.
Please let me hit him.
No!
Don't you ever knock.
It's my house. Do as I please. You're just guests. What's so fascinating about that picture anyway? It's hideous.
You won't see it from the other side of the door.
Edmund, it looks like the water's actually moving. What rubbish, see? That's what happens when you read all those fanciful novels and fairy tales of yours.
There once was a boy called Eustace, who read books full of facts that were useless.
People who read fairy tales are always the sort that become a hideous burden to people like me, who read books of real information.
Hideous burden. I haven't seen you lift a finger since we've been here. The right mind to tell your father it was you who stole Aunt Alberta's sweets. Liar. Oh, really?
Edmund, the painting!
I found them under your bed. And do you know what? I lit every one of them.
Oh, I'm infected with you! What's going on here?
Today,
Some kind of trick! Stop it or I'll tell Mother! 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 I'll just smash the whole thing.
we're in Narnia. Yes, you're in Narnia.
I don't want to go. I'm going to go back to England. I'm going back to England.
That was thrilling.
How in the world did you end up here?
I have no idea.
Caspian,
Edmund,
it's great to see you.
to see you.
Didn't you call for us?
No, not this time.
Well, whatever the case, I'm just glad to be here.
Rikichi!
Your Majesties,
Hello, Rick. What a pleasure.
the pleasure is all mine, sir. But first, what to do about this hysterical interloper?
That giant rat thing just tried to claw my face off.
I was merely trying to expel the water from your lungs, sir.
It's all... Did you all just hear that? He just talked.
Oh, actually, it's getting him to shut up. That's the truth.
The moment there is nothing to be said, Your Highness, I promise you I will not say it.
But I don't know what kind of prank this is, but I want to wake up right now.
Perhaps we can throw him back.
I demand to know just where in the blazes am I?
You're on the Dawn Treader, the finest ship in Narnia's navy.
Okay, so what was Eustace's attitude? Eustace is the little kid, in case you haven't watched the movie, to his cousins in Narnia at the beginning of the movie. He was arrogant. Yeah, what else? That they were crazy, yeah. He didn't believe that Narnia really existed, did he? He thought they were read too many fairy tales. Hey. So then what happens? What happened to him?
Dragon.
So he's dragged into Narnia and he's still not believing he's there. He's not coping very well, is he? What about Edmund and Lucy? How did they respond to getting dragged into Narnia? I don't think they were expecting it either, were they? They were happy? And Eustace still wasn't happy, hey? I love that kind of passing out when yet another animal speaks to you. Okay, so I guess this is fairly close to the beginning of Explosion, and I figure that there's probably some of you out there who, in your everyday life, feel a bit like Edmund and Lucy. You know Narnia, you know your faith, but you suffer a bit for it. So coming to something like Explosion is a bit of a relief for you, and you're able to go with the flow and allow yourself to be swept away. Enjoy the experience. But I suspect that there are others here who are a bit more like Eustace, who have questions, who are a bit more sceptical. The idea of a God who loves you and wants to be friends to you does sound like a fairy tale. It's not your experience. And all of this talk about it's totally freaky. That's alright. That's what this is for. I guess what I'm recommending to you all is to go with the flow. Don't toss this Narnia thing. Don't toss this Jesus thing. Don't toss this idea of God's love out untried. What I want to recommend is that you call God's bluff. That you dare Him to show you that He loves you. That He wants to meet you. That He wants to be friends with you. If what I'm saying is true, if God's love is unconditional, if His love is passionate, His love is forgiving, enduring, trustworthy, selfless, and He loves all of us, then He loves you too. And He wants you to know that love. And if you're Eustace right now, and you're thinking, yeah, that's not true, I want to dare you to not go away from this week without trying Him out on it, without saying, all right, God, I'm Eustace, and if you really want me to know you, if this is really true, then I want you to show me. I want to use this experience. I want to be washed away into this fairy tale. I want to experience the fairy tale for myself. Because the God I know is passionate enough about you that He will find a way to meet you. He will find a way for you to know His love. Can I have the second clip now, please, Brenda?
This is our last time here, isn't it?
Yes. You have grown up, my dear one. Just like Peter and Susan.
Will you visit us in our work?
I shall be watching you, always. In your world, I have another name. You must learn to know me by it. That was the very reason you were brought to Narnia. That by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there.
Okay, so imagine Explosion is Narnia. Here is your opportunity to come and know God, to come and meet Him, to meet His love in a safe place, so that you can take that experience back out into your real world in a stronger way. God has drawn each of you here to Explosion because He desperately loves you. He wants you to know that, and He wants to encounter you here. He wants to be friends with you, each of you. My challenge to you is allow yourself to be carried away by Him. To allow yourself to be swept away into this week, so that you can carry this experience of a love that is unconditional, a love that is forgiving, that is passionate, that is open, that is enduring, patient, steady, stable, trustworthy, selfless, and eternal, back into your everyday life as something that sustains you every day. Thank you.